It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Adriana, who is our Tinker Visiting Professor this semester. And Adriana will be staying with us for a little bit longer because she will be the next associate director of LACIS. So,
Thank you.
Adriana will still be with us. The title of the presentation today is Women's Voices in Climate Change Activism in Colombia's Public Sphere. So I'm going to pass it over to you. And thanks.
Thank you very much for this invitation. And also, I want to spend like 5 seconds saying thank you to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and to LACIS and all the team, Alberto, Sarah, Jacob, all of you for having me as a Tinker professor. It's been the honor of my life, really, to have this opportunity to meet so great people, have my students here in the university, the class. So thank you very much for this opportunity and for this invitation today to talk about my research. So welcome to the talk. As Sarah was saying, the title of my presentation is Women's Voices in Climate Change Activism in Colombia's Public Sphere. So let me start by providing some quick facts about the context of my case study. Colombia is the most dangerous country for environmental leaders in the entire world. According to the latest report by one NGO named Global Witness, 4 out of 10 environmental leaders are murdered in Colombia. These leaders, for example, denounce illegal mining or deforestation that is caused by drug trafficking, or they are murdered because they support coca crop substitution, or because paramilitary groups dispose the bodies of murdered people in the rivers, and these environmental leaders denounce that rivers are no longer peaceful places for communities. Another problem has to do with the fact that paramilitary and guerrilla groups like the previous Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the National Liberation Army, ELN, contribute to environmental degradation through actions such as bombing oil pipelines, to extort businesses in the oil sector, and also to call for media attention to the general public. Third, in Colombia, the public debate on climate change and environmental protection started to be discussed with the presidency of Juan Manuel Santos back in 2010. At that moment, different publics and counterpublics, the government, environmental organizations, as well as activists, started to talk about climate change, deforestation, and related topics. But since the current presidency of Gustavo Petro, since 2022, there has been a strong focus on environmental issues, with the president even risking the economy of the country by halting new oil and gas exploration and committing to move away from fossil fuels. So in general, even though the entire world is engaged in a global conversation about climate change and environmental protection, this discussion takes different forms in each country according to the unique configurations of their public spheres. These variations arise not only from environmental and biodiversity characteristics, but also from national histories, contexts, and regional challenges. Today, I want to tell you a little bit about the public conversation about environmental protection and climate change in Colombia. This presentation today comes from a bigger project that I am just starting, and that big project analyzes the environmental discourses of 3 different groups in Colombia. Politicians, and I analyze former presidents Juan Manuel Santos and Iván Duque, and current president Gustavo Petro. The discourses also of important environmental organizations in Colombia, and the discourses of different environmental activists. In this talk today, I will I want to explore the discourses about environmental activists specifically. And to do that, I ask these two research questions. The first one is, what ontology do environmental activists in Colombia adopt to define and advance environmental justice? And the second question is, how do activists engage with Colombia's public sphere to advocate for environmental justice? So, political ecology is the broad theoretical frame that I will use to answer these research questions. In general terms, political ecology states that environmental issues are not only ecological problems, but that they need to be approached from different standpoints. This theory explains that we need to take into account economic, political, and cultural factors when we are studying problems of related to the environment. And as it happens with any theory, there are different approaches. And I use here the approach by Arturo Escobar because he is very careful to tell us that environmental issues should be approached from all of these economic, political, and social aspects, but also from an ecological perspective, which sounds really obvious, like we are studying ecological problems, we should not forget to take into account the ecological dimension, but he explains how some political ecologists back in the 80s became a little radical with the importance that they gave to discourses and in general to the political, economic, and cultural aspects, and they somehow forgot the ecological dimensions of environmental issues, which is of course essential if you are analyzing ecological problems. So Escobar explains how conventional political ecology has focused too much in discourse and it has neglected ecological processes themselves. Arturo Escobar also explains how political ecology must reintegrate these material and physical dimensions into the analysis. For example, some political ecologists back in the 90s paid a lot of attention to how deforestation in the Amazon was framed in global discourse as a crisis of governance and indigenous rights. But he says they paid little attention to the actual ecological consequences of that deforestation, such as biodiversity loss and problems related to the water cycle. So we need to find this equilibrium when studying and embracing this political ecology approach. In summary, for the theoretical frame of my study, I want to put into conversation two scholars that come from different traditions, but I think that can help me to have a particular standpoint on how activism, environmental activism works in Colombia. I'm trying, of course, to be careful to conciliate possible underlying epistemological and ontological differences among these two scholars, but the two of them come from a very critical perspective. So first, we have Arturo Escobar, who is a Colombian anthropologist and a critical theorist. This is the scholar that I was just mentioned about in his criticism to conventional political ecology. Arturo Escobar worked for several years at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also he was a professor at Universidad de Caldas in my city, in the coffee region of Colombia, Manizales, and also a professor at Universidad del Valle in Cali, in Colombia. So his main concepts that I am using for my study are, the first one is relational ontologies. With this concept, he emphasizes the interconnectedness. That is how humans and non-humans relate, and how they, humans and non-humans, co-constitute each other through relationships. And we will see throughout the presentation how important is this notion of relationships. So Escobar is not talking here about the dichotomy between humans and nature, but he is talking about relationships between humans and non-humans. Nature is not an object to be exploited, but instead he is explaining how humans belong to nature and humans and non-humans share the same essence, the same being, and therefore the same ontology. The second important concept that I have studied and used for this case study, defined by Arturo Escobar, is post-development. That is a critique to universal models of development and an invitation to implement localized, sustainable, and decolonized alternatives to social change. So it's a different way to perform social change that comes from the communities. The third concept is biodemocracy, which is a model that advocates for community-led biodiversity governance that integrates cultural and ecological diversity. I will show you in a minute how I use these concepts to analyze the discourses of Colombian activists. And the fourth concept is the pluriverse. This is a most recent work by Arturo Escobar over the last years. The pluriverse, according to Escobar, is a philosophical and political vision that advocates for multiple coexisting worldviews. It rejects the idea of one-size-fits-all development model and supports the multiple coexisting worldviews in the advocacy for territorial autonomy. And it will be very important when analyzing the discourses of activists in Colombia to consider these multiple coexisting worldviews, because this is what we are facing, at least in Colombia, having several discourses and several standpoints, some of them even contradictory at the same time. The second scholar that I am using for this presentation is Robert Eisen with his theory about the public sphere. Robert Eisen is a professor here at the Department of Communication Arts. And I found very useful his definition of both the public sphere and counterpublics. So the public sphere is a dynamic network of relationships. We have again, have here the notion of relationships. And this network connects individuals, institutions, and discourses to negotiate power and to make decisions that are of interest of the public in general. So we are talking about the public interest. And there is another concept that Robert Eisen explains with Nancy Fraser, that is the idea of the counterpublic. A counterpublic is a parallel discursive arena where members of subordinated social groups circulate counter-discourses to formulate oppositional interpretations of needs, interests, ideas. We are talking here about discourses of groups that have been excluded for a brief or a long period of time. So using these frameworks, that is the theory of the public sphere and Arturo Escobar's ideas on post-development, I critically analyze a collection of representative discourses that I took from, especially from YouTube, like long interviews and political debates and presentations, but also from different documents and interviews. These discourses were produced by 3 women activists in Colombia. They are some of the 3 more recognized activists in Colombia. The first one is Susana Muhammad, who is currently the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. She has worked in environmental and political advocacy for several years. Francia Marquez is the second one. She is the current Vice President of Colombia, and she has previously worked on defending the lands rights of Afro-Colombian communities, opposing especially to illegal mining and defending the river where she grew up. And the third one is Isabel Cristina Zuleta. She is currently serves as a senator in Colombia, and she have led the movement Ríos Vivos, like living rivers, working for the environmental protection of rivers. So, in relation to the first research question, that is, what ontology do environmental activists in Colombia adopt to define and advance environmental justice? We can say that environmental activism in Colombia is grounded in an ontology of territorial care, which includes three different rhetorics. Social justice, that is, territorial development needs to be thought in terms of both redistribution and recognition. Two concepts that are suggested by Nancy Fraser that help us to group the ideas that these activists are trying to circulate in the public sphere. The second broad rhetoric is popular or local knowledge, that is, local communities as the legitimate decision makers over their lands. And the third rhetoric is capitalism as a model of destruction, a very strong idea by itself. So let me briefly explain what I mean by this ontology of territorial care. Activists illustrate the complex relationship among three elements: territories, the defense of territories, and their personal lives. Here, activist discourse is strongly connected to the personal experiences of these women that I will talk in a minute. Many activists, not only them, but in general, environmental leaders in Colombia, are born and raised in the territories they belong. And it is from these places that they carry out their activism centered on protection, care, and defense. So for the first case, for Susana Muhammad, she views environmental activism through territorial governance. She talks about protecting water and managing land as key elements of ecological justice. Francia Marquez started defending the Rio Ovejas when she was 13 years old, and her activism connects environmental justice with territorial autonomy and resistance to extractivism. And the last one, Isabel Cristina Zuleta, fights against mega projects of extractivism with Ríos Vivos, the organization that she leads. And she is always telling the story about the river where she grew up. We need to take into account that rivers for both Marquez and Zuleta are not just water, but they are the places where they found their job, is a place to meet, is the place that gives life to community, is the territory of the community. So this ontology of territorial care that I just briefly explained includes three rhetorics. The first rhetoric is the one on social justice, and it is based on the idea that the exploitation of nature is linked to the exploitation of minorities, and therefore that the current environmental crisis is a global phenomenon that exacerbates global inequalities. This calls on the public sphere to address it in terms of both social and climate justice, where racism, patriarchy, and exclusion are both causes and consequences of this crisis. I want to share with you three brief excerpts from these environmental leaders so that you can have like an example of their discourses. So I will start with this one by Francia Marquez, who has worked several years in the protection of rights of Afro-Colombian communities. So she says, I wonder, now that we have talked about climate change, if we, women, will be burdened with the weight of this capitalist, colonial, and racist system? Will we be given the responsibility to transform it, or will it be a responsibility that we assume as a society? I cannot imagine the women of my country bearing the burden of the energy transition when we are already carrying the burden of care, a responsibility we have had for so many years. I believe it is necessary to distribute that responsibility, and it is time for the men of the planet to also take responsibility. A very strong mm, claim. So, according to this rhetoric, the environmental crisis is framed by activists as a phenomenon that is caused by and have consequences on social inequalities, and addressing those inequalities implies to take action of redistribution and recognition. This rhetoric, under Arturo Escobar's perspective, calls for the concept that I was discussing a few minutes ago of biodemocracy, that is a community-led form of democracy and territorial sovereignty that constitutes a way of resistance to neoliberal commodification, but also a way of resistance to gender, racism, and patriarchy. So this rhetoric also connects gender with the ethics of care, as you saw in the previous excerpt by Francia Marquez, because it highlights how women have been historically assigned the responsibility of sustaining both socially and environmental roles of protection. But men have somehow escaped accountability. In this discourse, care is not seen as something natural for women, but as a burden imposed by capitalist, colonial, and patriarchal structures, as Francia Marquez was saying, which makes the unequal distribution of environmental responsibility the core in core and direct relationship with ecological injustice. The second rhetoric through which this ontology of territorial care is enacted is local knowledge. Here, territories are places and agents that teach inhabitants how to use and understand the lands that they comprise. This territorial ontology establishes that the primary way to understanding and knowing is rooted in local knowledge. It is based on the belief that the inhabitants of a territory are the best suited to protect and care for that territory. And here I would like to share with you this excerpt by Isabel Cristina Zuleta when she was working as the leader for the organization Ríos Vivos. So she says, we are not environmentalists because we don't know about that, and our knowledge is popular. So we are popular environmentalists. But the government would tell us, you are not environmentalists because you are talking about human rights, about peace, about the disappeared. And we would respond, well, then what are we? Before, the government told us that we were human rights defenders. So we said, fine, we are human rights defenders. Then they told us, you are not human rights defenders. You are always talking about water, the forest, so you are environmentalists. So if we don't fit into pure environmentalism or a strict human rights defense, because it is not just about the rights, our rights, but also about the rights of the ecosystem around us, then where do we fit? It's very interesting that Isabel Cristina Zuleta explains some years ago in Medellin, there was this project to construct a very huge dam, the hydropower plant called Hidroituango. And she was, with her movement, trying to organize people to counteract with this proposal, with this dam, because the community was so worried because it would affect the river and the community itself. So they started to go to visit the local authorities and to say, please, don't do this, listen to us, we are the community, it's our river, it's our lives, so please stop the project. And of course, the local authorities didn't pay attention, but after much effort to try to be heard, the government said, okay, we will have some participation for you. So we will set a meeting, a participatory meeting, so that we can say that we hear you and we listen to your voices. And Isabel Cristina explains how people were invited through email to attend the meeting. And she says, of course, we are talking about rural communities that don't have access to, they don't have emails. They don't need emails. An email to do what? But anyhow, they went to the meeting, and in the meeting, the first thing is like a person giving them a brochure with all the explanation written, like why we are doing this, how is it going to be done. And she says to people who doesn't know how to read all the times, and even if they know how to read, it is not, it's technical vocabulary that they don't understand. So, and you cannot participate because you have not the technical knowledge. So that's why it is very important to consider this local knowledge that is not technical. It doesn't use the same technical vocabulary, but it is a way to say, I am the inhabitant of this territory. I have lived here for so many years. I know what the territory is saying. This rhetoric alludes to uh, alludes to Arturo Escobar's concept of ontological design, in the sense that local knowledge shapes reality, that is, communities design their world through lived experience and place-based practices. Design emerges from territorial relationships, that is, knowledge is co-constructed through interaction between land, the ecosystems, and the communities. And alternative ontology resist epistemic domination, in the sense that I was saying that it proposes alternatives to technical knowledge and to have a degree in environmentalism, but to be in the territory. We can add, in relation to this very interesting concept of ontological design, I want to add an example that I found very interesting in the work that Belkis Florentina Izquierdo Torres, who will be visiting the university at the end of the month, because of an invitation of Professor Sarah McKinnon and LACIS. So she has worked, she's an Arahuaca, so is a member of an indigenous community, the Arahuacos in Colombia, and she is the vice president of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the HEP, as we call it in Spanish. So she has worked to recognize the territory as a victim. Not only victims are people, but she's saying the territory is a victim, and she has done so, she has achieved this recognition within the transitional justice system in Colombia. That is a special judicial system that we implemented as a part of the peace process with the FARC. So her efforts highlight how environmental destruction, such as oil spills, illegal mining, and land contamination, harms not only people, but also the land itself, which indigenous communities see as a living entity. And remember that we were talking about humans and non-humans. By including the voices of elders who speak for the land, she integrates indigenous knowledge into justice processes and promotes the healing, I think it's beautiful, of both nature and affected communities. Here, Belkis Izquierdo is redesigning legal and justice frameworks to reflect an indigenous ontology where territory is a living thing, not just a land or a resource. So we have an ontological design of the judicial system to incorporate the environment as a victim of environmental destruction. The third rhetoric through which this ontology of territorial care operates is capitalism as a model of an economy that, instead of systematically destroying biodiversity, systematically produces it to stabilize the agricultural frontier. The key lies in creating an economy where the main benefits go to the community. This is one of the critical aspects and will require an absolute commitment from the government for at least 20 years to develop this process of ecological restoration and hold degradation alongside the community. This rhetoric that we see in this example alludes to Arturo Escobar's concept of post-development. Post-development rejects this idea of growth as the ultimate goal of societies. It promotes local autonomy and decolonization, and it is a model where communities defend land against extractivism. So going back to the second question of my study, that is, how do activists engage with Colombia's public sphere to advocate for environmental justice? We can see that activists engage in the environmental public sphere through an ontology of territorial care, in which the territory is more than a place, but it calls for a new form of democracy, that is biodemocracy, a new form of design, that is ontological design, and a new model of development, that is post-development. As a part of an ontology, these three concepts of biodemocracy, a new model of ontological design, and post-development are very appealing. As a counter-discourse from activists, they invite us to rethink the environment and to implement new ways of democracy and participation. And they are a very good example of the idea of counterpublic that I was explaining at the beginning from Robert Eisen, because they are bringing oppositional interpretations of development and democracy in Colombia by excluded groups. But even though they sound very interesting, we also have, I think, conceptually, something very interesting here. Remember that the next one. Two more, I think. Yeah, here. So even though these concepts of biodemocracy, ontological design, and post-development are very interesting, and they are like a very good example of counter-discourse, we need to remember that these women have been activists for most of their lives, for the most part of their lives. But recently, they have been elected in public office. So we can ask what has happened to these activists once they assume public office. And we also need to take into account something important. Remember that Arturo Escobar emphasizes the importance of going beyond discourse and examine concrete practices in the material and ecological realms. So this criticism that he was saying to conventional political ecology of going too much into discourses and forgetting the material conditions, we need to keep this in mind. And considering that, we ask the question, what happens to these activists once they assume public office? And what we can see in their discourses, in a first level of analysis, is that they have kept the discourse of resistance. Their discourse have not changed, even though they are not activists anymore, but we will problematize this idea. The discourse keeps the same, even though they have transitioned from being activists as a counterpublic. Once they are in public office, the discourse is the same. And interestingly, they still identify themselves as activists. So you can hear Francia Marquez saying, I am the vice president, but first and foremost, I am an activist. I am a leader and I am defending my territory. And the same with Isabel Cristina Zuleta now in Congress, and Susana Muhammad, they identify themselves as activists. However, and this is the complicated part, media and citizens claim that once in public office, these women have not implemented most of the suggested changes, and that social change hasn't happened yet. When they have tried to implement such changes, they are accused of jeopardizing the economy. So we have activists in power, in office, with power to make decisions, to change reality, but facing the difficulties of implementing social change as institutions and the economic sector in general resist to ideas that are so new and radical, like post-development and biodemocracy. In this context, we can think of some very preliminary conclusions. As I said, this is a project that I am just starting. And the first one is that there is a strong ontology of territorial care through which women activists understand the environment in Colombia. They bring those visions and identities to the public sphere. However, those perspectives are in conflict with other perspectives from media, citizenship, the economic sector, as well as different political parties in the Congress. In other words, projects and practices that you could consider as necessary for the country are denounced by activists who are now a part of the government, and they say that there are very problematic practices. Let's see 3 examples. Senator Isabel Cristina Zuleta denounces that the construction of dams or hydropower plants cause deforestation, river disruption, and loss of biodiversity. But at the same time, politicians from different political parties, the economic sector, citizens, justify energy expansion as essential for national development and economic growth. Marquez and Muhammad challenge the notions of development and economic progress by presenting large-scale infrastructure and extractive projects as environmental threats. However, the same projects are presented by other politicians and by the economic sector, not as threats, but as necessary to modernize the country and be self-sufficient in meeting water demand. Even by environmental organizations are saying the same. If we don't have these dams, we won't have enough water for the country for the next years. And the third example, Muhammad and the current president, Gustavo Petro, because they are the same government, they share the same ideology. They oppose the use of fossil fuels because the consequences that they have on climate change. However, the economy of the country highly depends on oil, and there is no clear transition plan to use cleaner energies. So we have media, citizens, other political parties, environmental organizations saying we need to keep on in using oil because our economy depends on that. The taxes that oil businesses pay because of their activity goes to health and social programs, education, minorities, and we depend so much on this. It's our highest dependency in the Colombian economy, oil. So they are saying we don't have a clear plan of transition. We cannot hold oil and gas exploration. These few examples show how difficult and different is to bring social change in environmental matters in Colombia, as the public sphere is changed by competing visions of progress in which environmental justice advocates that are now in power challenge traditional models of development. This tension reflects how the public sphere in Colombia is a space of constant negotiation where conflicting discourses on development, sustainability, climate change, and economic growth struggle for legitimacy. Thank you very much for your time.
Folks, we have plenty of time for questions, so I open it up. And if you are on the Zoom here with us, feel free to either type your questions in chat or you can raise your hand and I will moderate for Adriana and you can ask your questions out loud. So I open it up to all of you.
Yeah, very interesting analysis, Adriana. I wonder if you can say something about with all these tensions, what would the role of the message that Colombia could bring to the next COP in Brazil? That, or if any, or if it's gonna be more like thinking it from the big four.
I think that it will be an important role and that Colombia will do in the next COP in Brazil. I also think that what Colombia could bring is not like the accomplishment of changing of structural changes, like embracing biodemocracy or post-development, which I think is very ambitious. Like we are talking here about changing the economic, political, and social model of a country. So I don't think that as some politicians, especially those in power now, they will want to take like those experiences to COP and to show we are now in a post-development model, but I don't think that that will happen. I think that what we can offer in these spaces are particular experiences, isolated but important. And I don't mean as isolated because they are like small practices without meaning, but because they don't necessarily belong to a complete change of paradigm in our country in political and economic terms, but experiences that are important. For example, the work that Belkis Izquierdo is doing, like having this decision of considering a victim the land as a victim. I think those experiences could be like a small, they are not in the general frame of a biodemocracy government or a post-development one, because we need to be like playing in several models at the same time. But I think that what we could offer are examples, because even though we don't see like radical social change or the implementation of new models, we see some experiences specifically with communities. I think that the richness of this is in the communities themselves, more than in the political agenda of the president saying no more oil and gas for the entire country, because that's a discourse that not only jeopardizes the economy, but it's difficult to keep like for a long time. But those experiences that are more regional, more community-based, I think that that could be our contribution to the COP. Thank you.
Beatriz?
I want to talk about the concept of activism in Colombia, which is a very dangerous activity. How do you see that, not only in Colombia, but as females who are talking about the marginal?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, and when I was starting to study this like broad project about discourses on environmental protection and climate change, so I want to analyze politicians and environmental organizations and activists. And I decided to start first with the activities and activism itself, because I think it's very particular and interesting in Colombia. Not only because it's the most dangerous country in the world to be an environmental leader, and 4 out of 10 environmental leaders are killed in Colombia, but I also think that activism is a way of counter discourse. It's a way to say something that is not like the ordinary or hegemonic discourse in the public sphere. But in Colombia, it's especially interesting because you have the other option that is violence. And I mean, you can reach social change through being empowered, to being activists, or to through violence. So I think that this like middle ground of activism is public protest that is peaceful, but is a way to achieve like the results and to have the communities working for a specific objective. So I think that activism in Colombia is it's very interesting, especially now that these activists are now in power. So they have like the opportunity of their lives, because when I was analyzing the discourses of these women, I started in 2008. Like I have discourses from 2008, 2009, and you can see that the discourse doesn't change. It's the same like counter discourse. But it is very interesting that these women are saying back in 2010, 2015, they are saying, I want to be empowered to change this. I am an activist, but because I cannot change reality, I will go to the Congress. And Isabel Cristina Zuleta says this, I want to be always the leader of Rios Vivos because I want to protect rivers and the environment, but because I'm not getting done anything here, I will go to the Congress because I will have power to make decisions. And Francia Marquez says something similar. She says, I will be the vice president, not because I like power, but because I really want to work for communities. But they are empowered, and that change is like resisting to happen. So this is a historical moment for Colombia, because people are watching and people have hope in activism. In these discourses that you have been saying for years and years, I want to do, now you can do. When is this happening? So if you don't have, social change takes time, but if you don't do it quickly, people won't believe anymore in activism. So I think it's a very interesting topic to study. Thank you. Yes?
Charlie?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's very illuminating to think about the role of women in politics and environmentalism as a movement, as a cultural movement. To me, it's thinking also of the region, of the Latin American region. I know there are women in Peru, for example, or in Mexico, also, doing that. You probably know her work with Adriana in Peru. She has done a research and published a book on eco-territorial conflict and how women are the ones that, because men, the activists, are killed, right? Women end up being in that role, especially for Peru. So my question is double. I was wondering if you have considered the role of other women in the region in Latin America, and how that, like, sort of, is a similar situation, but during our, we inherited the whole colonial aspect of our history, right? And when it comes to consider the role of women, what is there any difference in countries to begin with? I'm also thinking about the culture, the work culture. With my students, we talk about that and how it can influence everything. There are how these women in power are creating cultural movement of campañas that will bring both the community and the nation to change the way of thinking. And I don't know if there's such movements are being happening in Colombia, because I know it's difficult. But,
Yeah, thank you. I would love to extend like the project, and I am now more like excited with the part of activism rather than political and the political discourse and the discourse of the environmental organizations. And I think that this idea that you were saying about the role of other activists in Latin America is so important, because we have the same like aspects, the same cultural background, historical background. And I think that what is common is not only the historical and cultural characteristics, but also this role of gender, this idea of care, because women are the ones who care for the other, for the babies, for the family, and now for the environment. And we have a climate change crisis, a global problem in the world. So who are the ones who usually take care of something? So these are women. So I think that especially because another situation that you were mentioning, the role of violence. So men are killed, women are killed, but women are not as associated as with this close relationship with illegal groups, drug trafficking. So it's like a different perspective that we have there. And I also like your idea about culture. I think that these movements and this community work is so powerful, more than political discourse, because it starts and it considers culture itself, because these communities are working from their culture. When they get together in the river, it's because the river is a part of the territory. But where political authorities invite a meeting, they don't do the meeting in the river because they don't know that it's not the culture. But if they knew the culture, they would do the meeting in the river because it's the place, it's the community itself. So I think that the power of these experiences that I was saying as isolated to answer Alberto's question, the power of those experiences lies in the culture, that they are thought from the beginning, from the culture of the communities and the people who belong that. And it is very difficult for me you were talking about campaigns, like thinking in climate change or environmental protection, like broad campaigns, like, because climate change is a problem for the entire world. But a campaign for the entire world wouldn't work because it is not considering the roots, the historical and the cultural roots of communities itself. So I think that this concept of culture is very interesting, and I can see it could be transnational. And I can see like very probable that this, we have like a transnational rhetorics of social change, capitalism as a model of death, and the idea of local knowledge across our countries in Latin America, because we have like the same experiences. Could you repeat, please, the name of the Peruvian leader?
Rocío Silva Santiesteban.
Thank you.
And the book is free online. She published it. It's a beautiful research. Yeah, I'm thinking about Bogota. Bogota changed, right? That was it was done by politicians, the two majors. And that, it's a city, a huge city like that,
Can do it.
through culture, through a movement, I think from politics and social movement. Like,
Yeah, you are right. If Bogota could, with Antana Mocus, 10 million people learning how to use the zebra crossing path, so we can do it in communities. Yeah, it's a very interesting example also. Thank you. Thank you. More questions? Yes?
So, as many of us are, I think, acutely aware, so much of the cultural tensions raging in this country seem to revolve around the questions of language and rhetoric. We see, so much in responses to a lot of sort of like linguistic initiatives taken in, by, in progressive academic and activist spaces, especially in like regarding race, gender, and like sexuality. In the United States, we haven't seen like a lot of those progressive discourses extend to environmental spaces. And I'm wondering, when you have these popular leaders talking about rivers, for instance, in this entirely new ontological way, as, living entity in their own right, or an extension of our communities, how is that received in like the public sphere? Is it inciting like a lot of I don't know, rejection or mockery? Yeah.
Very interesting question.
Yeah. What do people?
I think we have like the two opposites, two opposite sides. Like people who really identify with those rhetorics, they are saying, yes, that is the way. The ecological justice is a justice that's considered racism, gender justice, like all kinds of justice in terms of recognition of minorities, historical recognition of the past, redistribution. but for other people, it's just like mockery, like, oh, they are talking once again about and political parties like use of course in X, in Twitter, in the public sphere, in social media, in the discourses as a way to undermine the discourse of the other. Like, oh, you are talking again. So you need for a no, I don't know. You are talking about deforestation. You really need to talk once again about gender, patriarchy, racism, social injustice. Is like the more you repeat that, like people tend to minimize the meaning that these rhetorics carry themselves. But yeah, I think that it is used as a political, as a rhetorical strategy to undermine the political view of the other. Thank you. Very interesting. Yes.
Just thinking, kind of related to what Jacob just asked, and more of a comment maybe about what you were talking about here. I think what's so frustrating is that, like, the first woman that you gave an example of, I think her name, she was talking about how men need to take a role and that, you know, women don't need to take on yet on their own yet another. But it's frustrating that it's like, if you bring a man, I mean, I know this is a kind of controversial thing to say, but just say, in a lot of spheres, if you bring a man into the conversation or into the space, it like legitimizes the argument. And that's, I mean, I could just, there's just so many examples of that. I even think about here with the recent presidential election, like Kamala Harris had a man as her running mate, and I thought, how cool if we'd had two women that were running, but the country wasn't even ready for like a woman to win let alone like two women. And so that's just, I don't know if that's exactly a question, but I just wondered what you think about that, about how like bringing a male into the space or the advocacy work can help like legitimize that, and people might listen more to the group than if it's just a whole group of women.
I think that is happening in Colombia with the fact that the president, Gustavo Petro, is trying to defend these women in the public sphere all the time. Like when, because of Jacob's question, like they are using all of these rhetorics to undermine environmental initiatives. So the president says or writes or publishes something like defending these discourses about activism and that are made by these women in power. So I think that is the same. It's the same as here.
Go ahead, Alec. We can do one more question. I'm gonna wrap this up.
Was there any representation of like these counter-hegemonic discourses in government, like in official positions of power before Petro?
Interesting. No, not to this extent. No, this is like very new for the country because it's our first government in the left. It's the first time that these rhetorics are used here, but there has been a strong conversation about environmental protection for the two previous presidents, like a very important point in the agenda, but not with these rhetorics, not with this vocabulary. It has changed
Like
in 2010. But like a very middle, not radical position, like let's ask businesses to help us to the extent that they want, like they can, but this is like very, very new for the country. Thank you.
Adriana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Thanks for